Okay. So welcome everybody to this Division 49 CE. I guess maybe before I start sharing, one, you already know that the recording is in progress. I just want to say that I'm Aziza Belcher-Platt, in case you don't know that. Thank you all for joining us for this continuing education webinar. I'm the education and training rep for APA's Division 49, and on behalf of Division 49 CE Committee and all of Division 49, we welcome you to this webinar. So usually this is the part where I go into introducing whoever our presenter is, but since I'm the presenter, I guess going to turn it over to me. So I'm going to admit one more person and then go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so in turning it over to myself, we are talking about sorrow, solace, and social identities, incorporating aspects of identity into our group and grief work. So again, thank you all for joining us live or for watching via the recording. Thank you so much for what you do as grief workers in your work. So if you've never seen me present, I tend to speak fast. And if I'm going too fast, I want you to please feel free to unmute and ask me to slow down. In general, I want you to feel free to unmute throughout the presentation. I'm really here for us to talk together and not for me to just talk at you. So you don't have to wait till Q&A or any of that. If you have thoughts, and at some point, I'm going to throw out questions and I'm going to want you all to talk to me. People often ask about the slide deck. And so, yes, I will send it when I send the follow-up email so you can have the slide deck with the resources. I do want you to grab a piece of paper or open a note device, a note app on your device, because there are going to be some times where I do want us to jot some things down as we're going through this process. Okay. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about me since I didn't do an introduction, right? I'm an African-American woman. I identify as cisgender. I'm able-bodied. I'm based here in Atlanta, Georgia, which is the home of the Muskogee and Creek people. I'm a licensed counseling psychologist. I practice, I do some research, and I consult. But I actually really want to introduce myself to you all through how I came to grief work, if that's okay. So the beautiful person you see on the screen, her name is Sabonfu Somé. She died in 2017, but prior to her dying, I attended what she would offer. And just let me say this, her name means keeper of the ritual. So from a very young age, she was sort of like mentored into the work that she ended up doing. Um, I had really devastating losses in my family in 2011 and 2012. And my wonderful therapist, Philippa Barr, said, I've heard about this grief ritual and you might want to attend it. And so in addition to some other things I was doing, this is one of the things that I did. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this grief ritual, but I just wanted to show you some of the text that Sabonfu wrote before she sort of passed away, because I think that they're really helpful. And they'll be included again in the slide deck so you can find these texts if they seem like they might be helpful to you. So this is in her own words. For my people, the Dagar tribe of Burkina Faso in West Africa, we see that in life it is necessary to grieve those things that no longer serve us and let them go. When I grieve, I am surrounded by family, reassuring me that the grieving is worthwhile and I can grieve as much as I want. We experience conflicts, loved ones die or suffer, dreams never manifest, illness occurs, relationships break up, and there are unexpected natural disasters. It is so important to have ways to release those pains, to keep clearing ourselves. Hanging on to old pain just makes it grow until it smothers our creativity, our joy, and our ability to connect with others. It may even kill us. Often, my community uses grief rituals to heal wounds and open us to Spirit's call. So I'm curious if you have any reaction to that or thoughts. This is a place where you are welcome to unmute and join in, but no pressure. So there's something else that Sabonfu said, which is communal grieving offers something that we cannot get when we grieve by ourselves. Through validation, acknowledgement, and witnessing, communal grieving allows us to experience a level of healing that is deeply and genuinely profoundly freeing. Each of us has a basic human right to that genuine love, happiness, and freedom. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the ritual that I attended with her. It was in 2015, I believe. And so, we were at a retreat sort of space and everyone was staying the entire weekend. We were all strangers to each other. And while Subonfi started off by lecturing a bit, a lot of it was really sort of experiential. And so there were 3 altars, which we all helped to set up. The main altar was the grief altar. The other 2 altars on the side were the ancestor altar and the self-forgiveness altar. And so the way it worked was everybody put something on the grief altar that sort of represented what they were there to grieve. And the rules were this: if someone approached the grief altar, somebody else had to, just raise their hand and say and point, I'm following this person. So someone approaches the grief altar, they kneel down on the pillows, they do whatever they want. They cry, they talk, they weep, they sob, they scream. It doesn't matter. The only rules for you as somebody who's spotting someone who's at the grief altar are that you don't touch them unless they ask to be touched. Like if they want to be hugged, but what we don't do is like offer them tissue and things to sort of like mop up the crying and sort of like see if we can button this up. We let them go as long as they want. And so what that means though is if you're there and you also then feel like you maybe want to kneel at the altar to express some of your grief, you simply raise your hand and someone else who's not at the altar will come and stand behind you as well as the other person. So one of the biggest things that I took away from this is that we do not grieve alone. There's always someone who is bearing witness to our grief. At the other altars, we sort of, thought about, reflected on where we wanted to go, where we had been, which was the reason for those altars. And so, again, I want to tell you, if it's okay, a little bit more about this experience. There were 3 people there that really sort of impacted me. The first was a man in his 40s who was diagnosed with a lower body cancer, and he was there to grieve his own life, the life he wouldn't get to live. Sweetest person, really very resolved and at peace with the fact that like treatment hadn't worked and this is where we were, and he had a matter of weeks to live. Um, and so that to me was actually really poignant to watch somebody else grieve their own life. And that was changing for me. So by the time I got to this grief ritual, I kind of felt like I had done a whole lot of grieving and individual therapy and other things. And I didn't know if I had a whole lot to grieve at this ritual. So I'm really sort of there also just to support people. And so this woman walked up to the altar. She was middle-aged. And so I just said, okay, I'm going to go behind her. And I'm standing behind her. And she had lost her daughter, who was in her 20s, to like cancer. And she wept and she wailed. And something about the depth of her sorrow really penetrated in a place that I thought I was done. And I thought, oh my gosh, I need to kneel here too. And so I actually didn't stay behind her the whole time because something in her helped to break open something in me. And I really very much appreciated that. The other was a Black woman who was there with me. Um, and I sort of found myself running up to the altar to support people a lot. And she just sort of gently said, like, you don't have to be sort of a servant here. Like, you just need to sort of relax and be mindful of the ways in which, as a person of color, you may be running to take care of other people's grief. So I want to pause there and see if you all have any feedback about the ritual, if you know anything about it, if you participated in anything like it. What are you thinking? Not rhetorical. I want you to unmute and talk to me.
I'm curious if you can share like the process of like entering the ritual. And so like do you meet with somebody who is like overseeing it first and they hear a little bit about you, or it's kind of open and you show up?
So it was open. And again, Subonfu died in 2017. I don't know if anyone has picked this ritual up here in the United States. But it was really just, there were several people who were working with her to facilitate it. You sort of wrote in and said, hey, I'd like to attend this ritual. I can make the dates. The retreat space was very minimal, so it was really affordable. And that was it. And so it didn't matter what you were grieving, how long you had been, none of that mattered. You had grief, you heard about this ritual, you thought it could be helpful, you came.
Thank you for sharing.
No problem. Any other questions, thoughts?
Okay, so I came in late. When did this start?
So I did this in 2015. I don't know how many years they've been doing it, and it's part of the Sabonfu is from Burkina Faso.
No,
This
how
this
much did
presentation.
I miss today?
Oh, it just started at 12. I don't think you missed that much. We're only 11 minutes in.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Okay, so what I wanted to say is, unfortunately, for many, many years, I only knew about Sabonfo's husband's books.
Yeah.
I discovered it, I guess, about the time I was doing my dissertation,
Mm-hmm.
because I got, yes, this book, The Spirit of Intimacy, and the one about bringing in the children.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, gosh, it is so much deeper. As women write, we make it real,
Mm-hmm.
everyday situations.
Right. Yeah.
But I only saw online websites her husband's retreats. I never knew she did retreats.
Right.
Wish I did.
Yeah, I would have to tell you again, my individual therapist mentioned it to me, and I was lucky. I looked up on this, but it has been so transformative, which is part of why it shaped how I do grief work and some of the ways in which I think about going forward with grief. So thank you, Hanifa. I appreciate that. So this person is R. Benjamin Serlin, and he is executive director and one of the co-founders for Center for Loss and Renewal in NYC. And I have him here because as part of my grief work in 2012, 2013, all the way through 2015, Benjamin sort of runs this group called Adults Mourning the Loss of a Parent. And I'm sure that you all have had losses, right? That's just the nature of life. But there was something about this idea of like when my father died in 2012, I was in my 30s. I didn't need that, right? He didn't support me. I supported myself. I was a caregiver for him, right? And so it wasn't a loss of like, oh my gosh, what do I do, right? As a person in the world. But it was just this was the last of my parents who was living, and I really just I think other people maybe didn't understand, like, well, you're okay. I mean, right? And so being with folks in this particular bereavement group who'd also lost a parent and were in a very similar situation was really, really very therapeutic. And so I love and I refer people to this group because, again, grieving in community, I think, is really important. And you all know from having had losses, sometimes you're like, I can't believe people are going on. Like everything is okay. The world has returned back to normal. Do y'all not know what's happened? Right. And so if you don't have folks in your family that you're grieving with, or even if you do, but having people who are specifically in that place of grieving with you is so, so therapeutic. So, based off of my own experiences, here's some of the things that I believe about grief. I believe grief is sacred, right? And so I love a couple of quotes and I share them with folks. When you consent to love another human being, you're also consenting to grieve them. Grief is love's shadow, right? It's the tax we pay for the privilege of experiencing a meaningful relationship. I absolutely believe that grief can transform us, right? And so one of the things that I try and stress to folks that I'm working with around grief is that it's a threshold emotion. It's the entrance, right? We don't just get there and say, okay, well, I'm grieving, right? That's the beginning of it. The point is for us to go through the grieving process, right? So if we know love, we'll know loss, and there's no way of getting around it. And we don't think of grief as getting over, but we think about going through. grief shows up in our bodies in many ways, and oftentimes our body will remember an anniversary and sort of be responding to that, even if we don't consciously remember it. And then, as I said, it is an individual journey, but it's not a solo journey. And I think collective and communal healing can be really important. There's a person, this is a poet. I don't remember his last name, but I know his first name is Hanif. And I just want to play for you something he said about grief, which I think also sort of echoes what I think about in terms of grief being sacred.
About loss is you don't lose someone once. You lose someone a first initial time. That is the inciting event. And then if you live long enough without them, you lose them repeatedly for as long as you're alive and they're not. And that means that you have to get accustomed to burying someone repeatedly, which, if not thought of in a way that is generous, can be too daunting to live with. But on the other hand, if you believe, as I do, that grief is kind of just an emotion that's knocking on the door of memory and asking you to recall something, then there's real gratitude in that. There's real gratitude in recollection. There's real gratitude in me reaching for my mother's voice even when I don't retrieve it, because I'm reaching for my mother nonetheless. It reminds me that I am losing a person over and over and over, but by losing them, I get to return to the site of their living that I can recall. And that is celebratory.
So,
Outlaw.
thoughts about that and Hanif's way of thinking about grief? Any reaction? Okay. I will take that as a no unless I'm missing something in the chat. So here's a question where I do want you all to unmute. Please also feel free to turn on your video and tell me a little bit. I've told you a little bit about my grief experiences and my beliefs, and I'm wondering, what are the grief beliefs that you're bringing to this? None? You all have no beliefs about grief? Is that what you're telling me?
Well,
Or
I
Go
have several um based on the two clips. One is that my father wasn't really in my life until I was like 25 years old. And then we had several heart-to-heart talks, you know, then not too long afterwards, he passed away. But when it came time for his funeral, I wasn't gonna go because I was like, well, he really wasn't there for me. But I can say that, as you were talking about the body, memories, I was actually in the car and got a lot of anxiety and fear. And when I got home, my grandma called and said my father had passed away about the same time that I was feeling all that anxiety. Then I felt like I was out of whack, disorientated for the whole next year. And I'm like, I didn't even know the man. What the, you know? I know that it's transformative. I actually wrote a book, Mother's Love from Beyond, a healing journey from loss and grief. So how even 30 years later, if you want to go with African beliefs, because I didn't know about it myself, in terms of the use of mediums, going to a medium and having a relative come through or any loved one come through. And my mother started coming through after all those years and actually giving guidance and actually gave me some pretty tough assignments
Yeah.
kind of forced me to evolve and transform.
Yeah. Thank you, Hanifa, for sharing. I appreciate that.
So
Anyone else want to share some of your beliefs and experiences with grief?
this is Latasha. I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'm trying to turn my camera on.
Yeah.
Okay,
There
there
you
we
are.
go. Hello.
Hi.
Hello. So very similar experience to what the lady just described. Like even if you don't have like a regular contact with someone when they leave, there's still like this deep sadness.
Mm-hmm.
And what I've come to believe about grief, just overall, is grieving an idea that this person is going to be here longer,
Mm-hmm.
grieving the idea you're going to be in a relationship longer than what it lasts. So, grieving the idea that we thought we were going to have the ability to use our limbs and such, to a certain time period. So I think it's grieving an idea. Even when it comes to sexuality, I had a client that I explained to her what she was going through was grieving. She was
Mm-hmm.
grieving what people told her she should be and what she thought she would be
Mm-hmm.
in it while she's accepting who she is. So it's an
Yeah.
idea. At least I
Yeah.
believe it is.
No, I love that. I think you just introduced something perfectly that we're gonna get to later, but I really appreciate that. Anyone else? Last call before we move on? Okay. So, some words get used interchangeably, and we might use them interchangeably here, but I did feel like it was helpful to put a definition to say that grief is the process of reacting to loss, right? Whether it's death, whether it's illness or disability, like Latasha was just talking about, a social loss, a relationship, something, a friendship, anything like that. Mourning is the process by which we adapt to it, right? So that's how we sort of come to decide this is how we're going to live with this loss. And that's significantly influenced by our culture and different practices and rituals. And bereavement is the period after a loss during which grief and mourning occurs. So just to clarify between those, a couple of other things, and we're talking about definitions that I like. Grief is multifaceted, right? And then Klaus and Stefan have this definition that says grief is an interaction between interior, interpersonal, communal, and cultural narratives by which individuals and communities construct the meaning of the deceased life and death, as well as the post-death status of the bereaved within the broader community. Okay. So again, in terms of interchangeable terms, often these get used interchangeably, race, ethnicity, and culture. And so when I say REC or something like that, I'm referring to all, right? Because there's a lot of overlap, but race being, the physical attributes, but there are many cultures within race, right? Ethnicity belonging to a specific nation and culture, right? But again, there are many ethnicities within cultures, right? And then social behavior is the culture, right? The norms that go with how we live, and that can sort of be varied and have some overlap. So I am curious, how do you all identify, if you're comfortable sharing, in terms of race, ethnicity, and culture? And you're welcome to put it in the chat if for some reason you don't want to unmute and speak out loud. But any thoughts? Do you
I'll
feel like you might know how you identify in terms of race. Do you feel like you know how you identify in terms of ethnicity and culture?
I think that our race is defined. I can't remember the federal organization. I think it's like the Budget Management Office or something like that. They
Congressional
are
Budget Office?
yeah. That's an interesting folk, to be defining race, but
Mhm.
that's how it's defined. But the culture is like our beliefs and how we act
Right.
and believe and interact with one another.
Right. Yeah. So like I told you all that I'm African American, I have indigenous ancestry. I grew up here in the United States. And so I very much identify with Black culture here, but I'm also Pan-Africanist. And so I understand and connect with folks who are all throughout the African diaspora. Um, so when I use these terms, I want you to know that I'm using them in the most expansive sense of the word, in the diasporic context, basically. So it includes all the people of that descent, wherever they may be in the global diaspora. And I think it's really important for us to acknowledge that the context of these social identities are really significant aspects of our interpersonal interactions. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I just wanted to put them here. Right. So when I say the African diaspora, it's a little bit about what I mean. The entire continent of Africa, the Caribbean, South America, Asia, Europe, and Central America, wherever people might be, because of migration or colonization or whatever it may be. When I talk about the Asian diaspora, again, in the most expansive sense of the word, East, South, Southeast Pacific Islanders. When I talk about the Latin American diaspora, the entire continent of South America, Mexico, Central America, islands of the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, Oceania, Europe, North America. Indigenous, when I say that, I don't just mean what you might think, which is where we're, because we may be located here in the United States of the Americas, but I'm talking about folks in the Arctic, Oceania, Canada, the Americas, and Europe. And of course, there is a Caucasian European diaspora, which I think sort of sometimes gets muted because white is often seen as normal. But I mean folks from Northern Europe, Western Europe, Southern Europe, and Eastern Europe. And these are some of the places that fall under that. So again, culture, ethnicity, and race impact how we experience the world, our physical experiences and belief about health, illness, disease, death, health promotion, healthcare seeking, and treatment and provider experiences. Also influences our mental health challenges, strengths, and needed supports, and every clinical encounter that we have. Each culture has its own attitudes, beliefs, myths, rituals, traditions, and ways of perceiving loss and expressing grief and mourning, as well as defining pathways to life after a loss of some sort. I want to emphasize something that nuances are important, which is the reason for me emphasizing the diaspora, right? It's really important that we are aware of, we understand, and we acknowledge the diversity between and within people's racial, cultural, and ethnic experiences. As much as possible, we want to appreciate the historical, socio-political, and cultural values of each group and the impact on mental health. We want to understand intergroup differences as well as intragroup differences. And then we want to always consider and collaborate on culturally appropriate goals when we're working with folks, even in grief. Again, just a reminder, no racial, cultural, ethnic group is a monolith. They're not homogenous. And so individual variation has to always be considered, including situations of death, grief, and bereavement. And it's really important that we understand the customs, rituals, and beliefs of the groups that folks belong to, their experiences of death, grief, and bereavement, so that we can help them through that. Okay, this is one of my favorite graphics when I'm doing grief work. It's called a tangle ball of emotions, because one of the things that I think is important when we're doing grief work in general, and particularly when we're trying to be culturally responsive, is to know that there is nothing that is taboo or off limits in terms of how someone is feeling and grieving. So you can see there's a little bit of everything here: fear, anger, rage, resentment, inadequacy, disappointment, anguish, anxiety, panic, dismay, sorrow, vindictiveness. So I'm curious what you think about this little ball of yarn and these emotions. Any reactions to that? Okay, I'll take that silence as a no. Were you still looking at that, Hanifa? Because it looked like you were looking, so I didn't want to.
Yeah, I was looking. I just didn't want to. I was debating whether I'd say anything since this is being recorded.
Got it. You absolutely do not have to say anything if you don't want that captured. The other thing I want to share, in case you all haven't ever seen it, and I feel like this is really helpful, there's an organization, Refuge in Grief. And oftentimes people are told, like, hey, wrap this grief up in a couple of business days. You get a little bit of bereavement leave, come on back, right? And you only get bereavement leave if it's a death, as opposed to the loss of a relationship or an illness or any of those things, right? So I really try and give this to folks as you have the right to whatever your grief journey is, because I wanted them to give themselves permission to be authentically themselves, to engage in whatever racial, ethnic, cultural practices are part and really important for their grieving and bereavement. And so along with that, in addition to this Grievers Bill of Rights, in case you've never seen it, someone else created the Mourners Bill of Rights. So kind of similar. And I'll send you these. It'll be in the PowerPoint, but I'll send you the links if that's helpful. And then somebody created the Bereaved Holiday Season Bill of Rights. And I think this is apropos given that we are in what for many is a holiday season, right? And for many people, this is maybe a first holiday, a first New Year or what have you, since they've lost somebody or had a major loss. And to be able to give them as much space and permission and grace as possible, and also just to be aware of what it might be for someone else if we've not had that experience ourselves. So, okay, getting to some of, something specific in this country. Evans has an article out from 2020, and I really like this quote. Grief in this country has always had an equity problem, and 2020 has only amplified the issue as Black deaths have come in back-to-back blows from the coronavirus, police brutality, and the natural deaths of those we look up to most. Each new death, each new example of an old injustice renews our grief, sending little shockwaves of sorrow. We are in the middle of a Black bereavement crisis, and we do not have the privilege or time to grieve. Now, while Evans was talking specifically about Black people, I do think that this is applicable to groups whose identities have been marginalized and who are constantly dealing with assaults on their group. So Harris has a great sort of multidimensional concept of racism-related stress, and we're going to go through some examples, but just to briefly say, there are life events, the things that happen to us directly, microaggressions, which we'll talk a little bit about, vicarious life experiences. It didn't happen to me, but I saw it happen to somebody else, or I witnessed it, I saw the cell phone video, and I relate to it because I know it could happen to me. The chronic contextual stress of all the institutional and systemic inequalities, the intergenerational transmission of trauma, when we talk about sort of these traumatic stressors based off of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery and the massacre and displacement of Indigenous Americans and the Holocaust and things like that. And then there's, sort of collective trauma. And I think that 2020 is a good example of that. Many communities didn't know George Floyd or some of the other folks, right, who happened to be killed, murdered in that year. But sitting in another community, you could understand sort of what that did to that community, to that family, and you maybe had your own experience, so you know that experience is pretty close at hand or could be. And so with that collective trauma, I think we also have collective grief. For those, you're probably familiar with the term microaggressions, but I just want to acknowledge that Dr. Chester Pierce, who's a psychiatrist, coined this term back in 1970 to describe the behavior toward Black people by non-Black people, right? Sue and colleagues went on to sort of like really expand on it. And the way they describe it is brief, everyday exchanges that send denigrating messages to people of color because they belong to a racial minority group. Now, we've actually gone on to say, to expand that beyond to like aging and sexuality and gender and lots of things, right? But we're all sort of dealing with these things in some sort of way. Sometimes people take issue with the term microaggression because they don't understand the way it was coined and why it was coined that way. So just to clarify, the micro refers to the level between individuals, right? It's an interpersonal thing, so it's the micro level. And also, it's really not meant to say that it doesn't hurt at a macro level or it's not particularly painful, it doesn't stick with you. So it isn't meant to be a term that is invalidating. I just want to share this quick video about microaggressions.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem.
Oh, you're so well spoken.
Oh, just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while...
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date,
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
going grocery shopping,
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
commuting to work,
So when are you gonna have a baby?
watching TV,
We have to keep the Redskins name. It's part of our culture and history.
or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
Pretty.
Can I touch it, please? I want to Can I please?
is fucking annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
So I share that because I think it's one of the best analogies where it comes to microaggressions. And so you might be thinking, why is microaggressions important when we talk about grief? Because it can influence the grieving process of patients, of loved ones, of caregivers, and survivors. And I'll explain a little bit more. So when we talk about institutional issues, these are some of the domains, right, that people are impacted in around their race, ethnicity, and culture. There's generational trauma, right? And I love this graphic from KJ Hartwell in terms of what does it look like in the first generation? Maybe it's war, maybe it's colonization, maybe it's sort of like having to flee a country or whatever it might be. And then in the second generation, we end up with some sort of maybe physical, emotional abuse or untreated mental illness or low self-esteem or, complex PTSD, right? All these sorts of things. And then in the third generation, we still see remnants of that, right? Anxiety, depression, again, back to the low self-esteem, shame, and hypervigilance, and just being dysregulated, right? So that's one thing. If you've never heard of the term racial weathering, the concept is that the impact that the stress of racism has on the body affects the structure and the function of the brain, which leads to increased disease risk, the increased vulnerability of developing stress-related disorders and neurodegenerative diseases, early menopause, a diminished lifespan. And also, if you've never heard of the concept of linked fate, it's this idea originated by Dawson in 1995 that what happens to one's ethnic, religious, region, class group, whatever it is, shapes your own sort of like life perception, right? And it's been observed among several racial, cultural, and ethnic groups. So if I see that somebody over there can be killed, just unarmed for no reason, then that sort of makes me feel like my fate is linked to that. That could happen to me as well, right? Any thoughts on that before we keep going? I feel like I might be talking too fast and not giving you all a chance to chime in, so. No? Okay. Dr. Carter has talked about this framework of race-based traumatic stress, where we have the individual racism, the systemic racism, the direct traumatic stressors, and vicarious traumatic stressors. There's also a culturative stress, right? So we may be working with people who are immigrants or their family are immigrants. And so what may be leaning on them or pushing in on them, right, in terms of sort of the process of acculturation and immigration. And then there's the ambiguous loss and the transnational sort of bereavement or grief. So basically, when there are two types of ambiguous loss, when people are physically absent but psychologically present, and physically present but psychologically absent. So that, I think we all can sort of think of some situations, right? And then there's transnational bereavement and grief. So if I've immigrated, the death occurs away from somebody's homeland and away from their family and community, right? And so it raises a lot of questions for people about their identity and where do they belong, and then what happens in terms of the logistics of how the preparation of the body and the grieving is done, right? And so that can also lead to disenfranchised grief for immigrants who are carrying these extra layers of guilt and denial, right? Because they have immigrated someplace, but they're not able to participate in the traditional rituals, wherever they've come from, in terms of grief and loss. One of the things that we know about racism is that it affects physical health, mental health, health behaviors, and help-seeking behaviors. So I asked you all to grab a piece of paper or to open a notes app. So here's a part where I'm going to ask you to do something. So I will read these out in case it's just not big enough for folks to see, but the scale is this. 1 is definitely untrue. 2 is probably untrue. 3 is possibly untrue. 4 is possibly true. 5 is probably true. And 6 is definitely true. It's printed at the top in case you need to see it. But this is a racial bias and pain assessment. And so I want you to read each statement and rate the extent to which you believe it is true, which goes from definitely untrue to definitely true. Ready? Oh, there's something in the chat. Somebody's AI note taker is saying it's quiet in here. Okay. Thank you, AI. All right. So, number 1, on average, Blacks age more slowly than whites. How true or untrue do you think that is? Number 2, Black people's nerve endings are less sensitive than white people's nerve endings. Number 3, Black people's blood coagulates more quickly, and because of that, Black people have a lower rate of hemophilia than white people. Number 4, whites on average have larger brains than Blacks. Number 5, whites are less susceptible to heart disease like hypertension than Blacks. Number 6, Blacks are less likely to contract spinal cord diseases like multiple sclerosis. Number 7, whites have a better sense of hearing compared with Blacks. Number 8, Black people's skin has more collagen, that is, it's thicker, than white people's skin. Number 9, Blacks on average have denser, stronger bones than whites. Number 10, Blacks have a more sensitive sense of smell than whites. They can differentiate odors and detect faint smells better than white people. I can see your facial expressions, Anifa. 11, whites have more efficient respiratory systems than Blacks. Number 12, Black couples are significantly more fertile than white couples. 13, whites are less likely to have a stroke than Blacks. Blacks are better at detecting movement than whites. And the last one, Blacks have stronger immune system than whites and are less likely to contract colds. So, any reactions, thoughts to this pain assessment?
Could I ask about this this assessment? Is it something that's used in medical school training, or?
It was used to assess for trainees what their beliefs were with regard to folks of different racial, ethnic, and cultural backgrounds.
Because, you know, my first reaction to this is all of this is completely ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But then I'm thinking, but maybe this is what people actually believe.
it is very much what people believe and to some degree are still taught. Thank you, Rosemary, for asking. So in case you're curious, the items that are in white are true. White people are less susceptible to heart disease like hypertension than Black people. Black people are less likely to contract spinal cord diseases like multiple sclerosis. Black people on average have denser, stronger bones than white people, and white people are less likely to have a stroke than Black people. And if you look at those things, a lot of them come down to the inflammation that we know is associated with like racism and sexism and patriarchy and things like that. But believing that people's nerve endings are less sensitive, that they're less likely to experience pain. And when you're like, why are you telling me this when we're talking about grief? Because people's experience as they may be in hospice, their experience of their family and how a loved one is treated makes a difference in how they are grieving and some of the experiences that may be important to explore with them. I'm going to play
I have a
another video.
question about 6 though,
Yeah, go for it.
because as you know, new information is coming out there. Actually, nowadays it's more Hispanics and Blacks that are getting multiple sclerosis.
Mm-hmm.
And especially children. The problem is that it was said for so long that just Northern Europeans had the high rates of multiple sclerosis.
Right.
So the problem was that doctors didn't look for it to diagnose it in Black people.
Right.
But they're linking it to the lack of sunshine. We're not allowed to go outside and play because it's not safe. Then we're going to have vitamin D deficiency.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point in terms of like, again, we know that certain communities whose identities have been marginalized for centuries, right, are less likely to get the diagnosis, are more often thought of as drug seeking, right, as opposed to people who are really experiencing genuine pain when we think about sickle cell and things like that, and have to have more visits to get an actual genuine diagnosis versus somebody else, right? Or are often told, well, let's wait and see, where somebody else might be given a more immediate treatment. Hopefully this clip will play.
Imagine a fully loaded jumbo jet with 220 passengers and crew taking off and crashing today. And the same thing happened every day next week and every day next month and every day for the rest of the year. That's exactly what is occurring when we say there are racial disparities in health in the United States. Over 200 Black people dying prematurely every single day.
Okay. I want to give you a chance to react to that before I go on to the next thing. Any thoughts? Okay. So I think it's important for us to talk about not just health disparities, but racial disparities in the end of life care when we're talking about culture. And I'm also going to bring in disability to this. So Jessica Zitter, who's a doctor and is part of a video you're going to see in a second, says it's really important to consider that due to racial disparity in healthcare, patients and families who get to hospice might feel like they weren't given the same life-saving, pain-relieving care available and have been and are being discarded, right? So you're encountering folks and maybe even families who are in the midst of some grief or some bereavement, and it's not just the loss, it's the treatment up until that point, right? And I don't know if you all have been following the news, but like, I think it's Canada that has that made sort of like self-assisted suicide if you're sick or if you're disabled. And I don't know if you remember, but during Hurricane Katrina, there were people who were chronically ill or disabled, and they were actually killed as opposed to being rescued. Their life support and everything else was terminated because the decision was made that they don't have a quality of life, so they can go, right? And so this idea that when people are sick or when they're ailing or dying, are they getting the type of care you would expect from doctors and nurses and hospice, right? And did the family feel like their person was taken care of as best as possible? So I'm gonna, hopefully this video will play. Okay, let's see if we can get it.
Patient I write about in my book called, it's called Miss Mabel. So I guess it was a day or two after she'd been extubated, and I went to her room, and and she is starting to get a little bit more short of breath again. And I felt an urgency to understand what she wanted us to do. And I went into her room and I started to talk to her, and I was trying to do advanced care planning, and what do you think? Would you like, would you want to be on this machine again, or would you not want to be? And she's leaning back in the bed away from me. And at that moment, Keturah, the social worker, she was a social work intern. This was years ago. And all of a sudden, I noticed, she touches my arm. And I she was right behind me. She said, Dr. Zitter, do you mind if I give it a try? And I said, thinking, what did I say? Was I okay? Was I racially inappropriate? Was I disrespectful? And she moves in front of me, and I step back. And she looks at her and she says, she didn't touch her. She said, Miss Mabel, your hair looks beautiful. So, and Miss Mabel just relaxed. And all of a sudden they started to have this conversation. And then I could come back a few hours later with Keturah and talk to her. But I wouldn't have ever thought to call her Miss Mabel. And I would never have thought to talk to her about her hair. And that was really important.
You have to understand the dynamics that we're talking about here. It's about human beings not feeling respected and honored when they are in a very vulnerable position. And that's what we have to deal with. And if you deal with that, you're going to deal with the racism issue. You're going to deal with the judgmental issue. If we get to the point of seeing human beings who are scared, who are vulnerable, and who are dealing with all types of things in life, but then they come into a system where they're fearful, they have no control, they feel like they cannot speak for themselves and make decisions that are empowering. They don't feel like they have the autonomy. And so they're in a position where they're saying, I don't trust what's being said about my loved one, and I'm having a hard time. My love position that are empowering. They don't feel like.
So thoughts about the end of life experiences, the advanced care planning, and how that might land for patients and families? Okay. So when it comes to race, ethnic, and cultural issues, when we're talking about racism, it's anywhere and everywhere. It's day in, it's day out. It's every day of a person's life. And so as you can imagine, the cumulative impact of racism almost feels like you're carrying the world on your shoulders. I just want to show this. I'm not going to read all of these, but most of the mental health organizations and medical health organizations in this country have declared racism as a public health crisis. The CDC did the same in 2021, based off of some of what they were seeing with COVID and just in general. And so it's really important that when we are working with groups that have been historically harmed and excluded or are currently marginalized, that we are aware that they may be at increased risk of developing traumatic grief. And we'll talk a little bit about what that is, but important to consider the socio-political framework that influence the patient and family's experience so that we can help them. Grief can intersect with multiple parts of patients, families, and or community's identity, and may activate other layers of trauma, especially for people of color or other, marginalized identities. And so a social justice approach to grief considers how is this loss part of the larger microcosm, and how do we integrate community support and institutional change? To date, most grief research has centered on white, straight, cis, middle-class, older people, which means it is rooted in systemic biases, and it's normalized some beliefs about grief and mourning that may stigmatize practices by other cultures, right? And so it's really important for us to always honor the cultural beliefs and practices when we're dealing with a loss. So if we are ever questioning, denying, hindering, or shaming these processes, that can disrupt the grieving process. So to talk a little bit about some of based on what we've talked about in terms of what people who have marginalized identities might experience, we talked about ambiguous grief, right? Losses that don't have clarity, and it's not really clear all of what has been lost. Ancestral grief, that unexplored, unexpressed anguish and grief that we carry from our ancestors. Anticipatory grief, the grief that begins as soon as you know a loss is coming, right? So often that looks like terminal illness, but sometimes as people of color, we are grieving the loss of a life, as well as grieving those that we know will also be killed just based off of the trajectory of brutality or racism or things like that. Collective communal grief is when we feel it as a group, as a community, as a society, as a village, as a nation, right? And that is really common in communities that have been marginalized. Disenfranchised grief, right? Whenever you have a loss that somebody else doesn't really understand, and so they invalidate it or make it feel insignificant or stigmatized. The peripheral grief, right? I don't know this person, they're not directly connected to me, but I can feel it, right? As an example, because I saw that video and I imagine what it was like for that person in that moment and for the family and the community and that sort of thing. And of course, traumatic grief, right? Distress suffered due to a violent loss in a frightening, horrific, unexpected, violent, and/or traumatic way. We always want to honor secondary losses, right? So it's not just a particular loss like this person, right? But things that get lost as a result. Maybe it's the financial security. Maybe it's a sense of identity. Who am I now that this person or these people are gone? The loss of the past. The person who was holding all these memories with me is gone. The things that I thought the future would bring, my own sense of confidence or self-worth. Maybe my faith is shaken, right? I've lost other relationships. It may impact my own sort of health, right? My lifestyle, my sense of safety and belonging in the world, your direction and your purpose. And of course, all those milestones that come up, the birthdays, the anniversaries, whatever it is, all sort of brings it back. One last thing about types of grief that I want to share. There's Dr. Kenneth Doka wrote this book called Grief is a Journey. And he talks about 3 losses that we don't often talk about. The loss of a person we once knew, the loss of a person we haven't yet lost, and the loss of the person we used to be. And I think a lot about number 3 when you think about a society that doesn't allow people to be their full selves, to accomplish their full potential because they're being held down because of some aspect of their identity, right? And who they wanted to be or hoped to be or could have been doesn't come to fruition or won't. And so being able to grieve that. Before I move on, any thoughts about the types of grief and any of that, anything come up for anyone? Okay, I'm gonna take that as a no. Okay.
I think
Go ahead, Hanifa.
I think a lot of people, and it was spoken about just briefly, but I think it continues. I think since 2020, with the COVID shutdown, lots of these losses, the personal internal losses, with the constant changes and uncertainty, I think it has a lot of people evolving and changing, having to change even with technology,
right?
Staying up to date with technology and all of that. The loss of the person that we used to be. A lot of clients are saying they don't know who they are, and it's scary,
right?
Uncertainty around us.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anyone else? Any other thoughts about these types of grief? Okay. So one of the things that I think that I'm assuming all of you all here are helpers in some form or fashion, right? Whichever credential you have. I think we have to be honest about is that we often show up saying, I'm here to help, which is nice. And also historically, harm has come disguised as help. And so we have institutions in this country. We talked a little bit about medicine, right? Child protective services, law enforcement, immigration, that have shown up under the guise of we're here to help. And then what has happened is families have been separated and people have been incarcerated and people have not received the life-saving, pain relieving treatment. They've been experimented on, that sort of thing. And so we have to be honest about that and upfront about that, I think, as helpers in order to gain people's trust. We have to learn to address harm without causing more harm. I love this graphic, the Wheel of Power and Privilege. I usually do a little thing where I sort of locate myself in it as an example. So you can see power is in the center, and marginalization is obviously on the outskirts. So if I were to start for myself, in terms of skin color, I'm not dark skinned, but I'm obviously not white. And so I'm sort of in the middle. So not so close to power, but closer to marginalization. I have my doctorate, so post-secondary education puts me close to power. I identify as able-bodied and heterosexual and neurotypical, so close to power in those ways. My mental health, I'd say, is mostly stable. I wish it was robust. So a little bit away from power. I'm a large body size, so I'm as far away from the power as you can get there. I rent my housing, so sort of in the middle. I'm middle class. In this country, unfortunately, being an English speaker and especially a monolingual English speaker gives you a lot of power. And so I'm close to the power there. I'm cisgender, so I'm a little bit away from it. I am a citizen in this particular country, so I'm close to the power. The thing about that, right, is that some of these things, one, these places of power and privilege can change depending on the context. I tell people all the time that, like, if you know that I'm Dr. Platt, then maybe that makes some difference for you. But walking down the street, I'm just a large body size Black woman and nobody's thinking, she's probably a doctor, right? And so, that doesn't hold as much power and privilege as people might think, given lots of other things. Of course, we always want to have an intersectional lens, right? How do the ways in which we identify, how does that sort of come together? How does it collide? How does it intersect? What does that mean? Any thoughts on the power and privilege before we move on? Reactions to the power and privilege wheel, which you may have seen already, but okay. So one of the things that I think when we're doing this work, we first got to start with ourselves. So these are some of the models of racial identity development that I learned about when I was in grad school. I just talk about them all the time and suggest them to folks. And the point is that when you're in early stages of your own racial identity, you are not able to really engage in meaningful ways with other people who are different from you. And so it's really on us to sort of figure out, how do we grow ourselves up from some of these pre-encounter contact initial stages to the latter stages that allows us to have a more pluralistic way of looking at the world, a responsibility for dismantling systems of oppression and that sort of thing. We want to sort of find our consciousness as social political beings. So I want you to think of a race or culture that's different than your own. I'm going to give you a second to, you don't have to say it out loud, just want you to think of it in your head. Pretend the Jeopardy music is playing. Okay, I'm assuming you got something. So without using food, music, or attire, I'd like you to describe some of the dimensions of that community of people. How would you describe that culture, that race and that culture without using those things? And this is a moment for you. Please unmute, put it in the chat, whatever. Fun, outgoing, judged. Interesting. Thank you, Letitia. Others? Anything you want to share? Is it hard to think about how to describe a race and culture without those aspects? Maybe, I don't know. It's hard to read your faces. So one of the things that I want us to think about is, like, what's the history of that race and culture, their family structure, their birth and death rituals, the oppressions that they faced in the past and the present. So I love this iceberg concept of culture, right? Because we always love to think we are so worldly. We know all the things, right? And we really often know not nearly as much as we think. And it's really important for us to delve into some of the other nuances and aspects. So what you see here is Purnell's model of cultural competence. Purnell is a nurse and created this for nursing students and nurses. I've I've adopted this, and I really want to encourage you all to use it. Now, this may not be the clearest graphic, but what you can see is across these 12 domains, right? There's some really different ways of thinking about for the person, for the family, for the community, for the society. What are their views around communication and workforce issues and high-risk behaviors and nutrition and death rituals and spirituality, healthcare practices, right? So I think this is really helpful in thinking about how do we really get into who is the person or persons that I'm working with? What is important for them? What is actually something that's in their body, in their mind, as they're thinking about these different aspects? Okay, just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip that first activity because we're at 106. So I want you to try and remember the earliest experience you remember having with a person with a disability. Who was the person with the disability, and do you remember what the nature of their disability was? Do you remember what your relationship was to them? Do you remember if you had feelings about interacting with them? Did you have questions? And did anybody talk to you about your questions and concerns? And or if you had questions and you asked them, how did people respond? Do you remember how they explained the disability or illness? And do you remember if they used inappropriate names or narratives when describing or explaining it? So I like this activity because I think that disability is one of those things that most of us will encounter somebody, even probably as toddlers, that has a disability or an illness and we don't understand it and we're trying to make sense of it. And the way we see other people react to it or talk about it greatly influences the way we move as we age and grow older and mature with disability. I want to share a series of tweets from some disability activists that I follow who talks about the stages of grief when you realize that you have a complex chronic illness or you become disabled. So she says in stage 1, you generally go to the ER for most symptoms. You're scared, you need help, your body doesn't feel right, and you go assuming they'll help you. And if you were healthy previously, your expectation of the hospital is that you go in and they fixed you and then you go home. But once you are chronically ill, you have to quickly adjust to the reality that there won't be a fix. The ERs are designed to treat acute and immediately threatening life conditions and are woefully ill-equipped to deal with complex chronic illness. Best case scenario, they will ensure you're stable and not going to die, and then send you home with instructions to follow up with your own physician. Worst case, you'll be ignored, gaslit, or treated with disdain for misusing ER services. ER trips are also incredibly hard on a chronically ill body. There's a lot of sensory overload in that environment, loud noises, strong chemicals, harsh lighting, punishing wait times. More often than not, you can end up set back more than if you had opted out of treatment. And the realization is hard on people who are new to chronic illness because no one wants to suffer. No one wants to face the reality that there's many conditions that won't kill you but will ruin your quality of life. No one wants to accept that some suffering has no fix. There's a grieving process that happens when this realization is made because it shakes you to your core. Becoming aware that there's a lot of pain and suffering for which there's no relief is a hard thing to grasp. Once you've grasped your new reality, there's a second stage where you have to adjust to what it's like to stay home through pain and suffering that would send most people to the hospital. You may find yourself panicking and second guessing your decision. This stage is hard work. It's not easy to stay home when you're in pain and need relief. It's not easy to deny yourself health care, even if you know they can't help you. There's always a little voice in the back of your head saying, maybe this time will be different. It takes a lot of strength and resolve to push through the pain and other symptoms many of us deal with on a regular basis. It's natural to want a quick and easy solution, and it's very difficult to accept that those solutions don't exist. Once you've learned how to manage the pain and flare-ups without going to the hospital, you enter the third stage, which is effectively, I'm never going to the ER unless I'm literally dying. It's incredibly sad how many chronic illness patients end up feeling this way. So I include this in the spirit of disability justice. And so when I'm talking to you about the grief groups that we run, and Letitia mentioned this earlier about People aren't just grieving a loss. They may be grieving sort of, their physical or chronic illness. They may be grieving a terminal illness. They may be grieving a disability, or they may be coming to your grief groups and have a chronic illness and disability, which is separate from the grief that they're coming about. And either way, I want us to be thinking about how are we making things accessible to folks who have a chronic illness, are immunocompromised, have a disability. Are we prepared to talk to them about those things? Are we prepared to make sure that their needs are being met? I love that this is virtual. And one of the things about, since the pandemic started, everybody wants to go back to in person. But again, for our siblings in this society that are chronically ill or immunocompromised or disabled, some of the ways in which we gather together have not allowed them to participate. And so just being thoughtful about when you're bringing a group together, or if you're going to put together a grief group, how are you doing that? Is it actually inclusive? Does it make it possible for everybody to participate? I love this relationship window. I'm going to start here on the left, right? We don't ever want to do things to people. So I want us to be thinking about that. I'm not doing this to you. We don't ever want to not do things, right? Like I'm just, forget it. I'm not doing anything for anybody, right? And then if we move over to the right bottom, I don't want to do things for people, right? Because like, again, we're in this together. We're in community. So moving up to the top, we want to do things with people. I am here with you, right? Our liberation is tied up together. And so if we're here to grieve as community, if we're here to do this work, then we're doing it together. And that means we have to think about how do we create this space inclusive of everybody and what they may be bringing. So I always want to remind people, I want you to ask yourself, where are the gaps in your knowledge about other identities? Where are the gaps in your empathy about other identities and experiences? And wherever those gaps are, that's your work. You got to figure that out, right? You probably remember Johari's window from grad school. What are the things you know? What are the things you don't know? What's hidden from you, right? And so one of the things that I in community, it's important for you to have people who you ask or tell when you're not sure about something. Who is it that you go to, or who are your go-to people or your go-to resources? Who in your life tells you if you've said or done something that you're not aware is problematic, but can pull your coattails, right? It's really important to have that. And you have to give people permission to do that, because often they're like, oh, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings. But if you say, listen, I'm on a journey, I'm trying to be, whatever, then please, if you ever see me say or do or whatever, tell me, because I want to know and I want to be better. You have to make a lifelong commitment, as long as there's breath in our body, right? To self-disclosure, self-discovery. And we have to be able to make getting feedback, even if it's tough feedback, just part of the norm in our interactions. So as grief workers, and I know this is a lot of words, I'm not going to read all of them. They'll be in the slide deck, but our goal is to really be thoughtful about race, culture, ethnicity, religion, language, all of those things, right? And so kind of like in that video where Dr. Zita was talking about entering a room, when we enter a room with somebody, right, we're part of, grief work, and we've shown up to support the family and the patient. What do they want us to do with our shoes? Should our heads be covered depending on their religion or their culture, right? How are we mindful of their personal space and avoiding personal contact without permission or consent? And being able to ask the family, what are the family's values and customs and beliefs? The thing is, we want to avoid toxic curiosity. So we want to be curious, but not toxically curious. And what does that mean? It means when we're going for excessive details or inappropriate details that are sort of harmful or inappropriate, they're not necessary to the work we're trying to do. And as human beings, we're curious, but like being able to recognize when you're crossing that boundary. Who are the important community leaders that we want to involve in this grief work and any sort of rituals and support? We always want to use person first and destigmatizing language. If there is a language barrier, we want to use an interpreter when necessary so that we're not miscommunicating or not communicating with a family or with a patient, right? But even when we're using an interpreter, we continue to address the family and the patient. We're not talking to the interpreter, right? And we want to try as much as possible to avoid using children as interpreters. So especially in this grief work, right? Oftentimes children get used as interpreters in lots of daily sort of things, but if we can, we'd really like to not have them have to serve this role. We always want to respond to the family requests as respectfully and sensitively and thoughtfully as possible. Even if we can't do it or we can't accommodate it or we don't understand it, we still want to be in a place of respect and sensitivity. We always want to avoid faulting or exhausting race or culture, right? So we want to help people realistically anchor to aspects of their race and culture that might help them cope and get support and take the action that's necessary. But we want to balance between focusing on the realities of the oppression and the inherent strengths and resilience. So I don't want people to just walk in and say, well, your people are so resilient. Y'all got it, right? Like we want to have the, yes, there is a resilience there. And hopefully we can tap into that. And also let's acknowledge the oppression and some of the things that are also impacting you all at this moment. So why is group so great for grief? If I haven't convinced you of that based off of some of the experiences I talked about in the end, we talk about the therapeutic factors, right? Universality. Grief is universal, but I imagine that if you all have experienced grief, you also know it can be incredibly isolating. No one else understands what you're going through. Other people aren't grieving at the same time that you are, maybe, right? And your friend group, whatever it is, work is like, okay, you coming back in, what are we doing? And so being able to be in community, in group with people who are also grieving, can really sort of help. The catharsis of talking and having creative expression and crying, I think that's pretty self-explanatory, right? But the catharsis also opens up a pathway for healing and hope to other people. Like I told you, I was at that sort of ritual and I'm behind this woman, and the depth of her grief broke open something in me that I thought was okay, right? And so being able to be in that with each other, the installation of hope, right? This idea that like hope says that, healing is possible, and we will fill that void of pain and despair and loss, right? But until those feelings sort of start to decrease, we can also hold hope for each other. And then of course the existential factors, right? I mean, we talk about the existential isolation, which is like, I'm grieving, and also, of course, I'm now thinking my own mortality and whatever it might be, and just trying to find my place in the world, right? Because grief can be one of those things that is particularly disorienting. So what I've included here is a cultural bereavement interview. And again, I'll put the link in when I send the thing, but just you can see some of the questions we asked, right? What are the thoughts and perceptions of the past? How do we communicate with their past? Is there a sense of presence? Do we communicate with the dead? What's the emotional response, right? Are there dreams? Like, how do we see our dreams? Is that a trigger? Is that sort of a communication? Are there sort of like guilt if somebody has actually left the homeland? How do we rationalize that? What is our clarity and recall of the past? Experiences of death, right? Especially if it's violent or sort of like we're not present. How certain is the person that the relative, is the person that their relatives have died? Who participated? What was the fault? Are there any leave-taking rituals? What are we doing, right? And then, of course, when we talk a little bit about some of the other feelings that may come up when we're not present, right? Antidotes to cultural bereavement. What's our comfort from religious or spiritual beliefs and religious practices? So I think this is a helpful start. Again, I know this is a lot of words, but this is another one, right? Where they created a draft supplementary module to the DSM-5 cultural formulation interview that talks a little bit about cultural traditions related to death, bereavement, and mourning, right? And so just going to, some examples. Who should be present at these rituals and or the funeral farewell, and why is that important? How do your family, friends, others in community mourn and express the grief after the funeral farewell? Can you tell me a little bit about that, right? So these are ways to talk to people as part of either a pre-grief interview, if you're going to do a grief group or what have you, to understand who they are, who their community is, what are they coming with, what do they need from the grief group, which also helps us put together, hopefully, a group where people are sort of like pretty much aligned and can, sort of help each other through this process. So, okay, as we get towards the end here, remember that when we respond to patients and families that those involved may have currently had or currently have loss and crisis related to race, culture, ethnicity, other social identities. And if our actions are culturally insensitive, we compound those experiences. But if we're culturally responsive, we might create a corrective experience, right? The culturally responsive care that we provide to patients and families, and I can say this as somebody who had family members in hospice, will be remembered and cherished forever. I'm not going to go through this, but I do want to show you that I have a ton of resources at the end so that you all can find them and use them accordingly. And I'm going to stop talking. We have about 10 minutes for question and answer, suggestions, comments, whatever it might be. I know that we are, again, close to the end of the year, and there are lots of reasons for people not to be here, but I appreciate you all attending. So by all means, feel free to unmute, turn on your video, whatever it is you want to do, and share anything that you are thinking. Okay. Does that mean no questions, no comments, no suggestions?
I just want to thank you for the presentation. I didn't share as much during the presentation. A lot of my clinical work was coming up and just want to make sure that's not recorded. But I've had some very specific instances as a clinician where patients are experiencing microaggressions within the medical system, and I'm in the Chicagoland area, and so I would say a pretty like diverse area, and within medical institutions that are really renowned and like pride themselves on being connected with the community, but still hearing of like very, very specific instances that then result in folks taking on additional labor to be a protective source, versus maybe my white clients being more receptive to care workers or other folks providing care for their loved ones. And so this like compounding experience of racism, emotional labor, and physical labor, and particularly thinking about like the hospice period where it's so heavy and intense. And I think also, you know, this experience of after 2020 of kind of being in a constant collective grief state related to witnessing things via video or news outlets, and particularly via TikTok, like in such this like rapid, visceral way, has been really difficult. I lost my father to COVID, and we were not very close, and had some like pretty defining conversations about our relationship and what that would look like going forward prior to COVID. So had kind of established some boundaries there, but knowing that like rhetoric of like anti-vaccination and belief systems contributed to his death was like really hard to grapple with, of knowing like I knew we were on different pages, but like so much so that like this has resulted in his death. Like my future children will never meet him. And not knowing how to like really reconcile it. And because I think COVID added this layer of like unexpectedness, but also expected, right? Like I had in my mind this idea that like if folks are not getting vaccinated, people will die, right? Like factually knowing that and then experiencing that was, I think, still is really hard to reconcile. So I really appreciated your presentation, and yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing so much of that. And I know that even when the relationship is complicated, right? The grief is still like, okay, what do I do with this? And so I appreciate that and the work that you're trying to do in the institution that you work in. So thank you. Anyone else? Any other thoughts, comments, suggestions, reactions, whatever it might be?
I guess you mentioned earlier, even reading about people's stories. The book Halfway Home, people who have been incarcerated and what that does to their family. That's like all of those levels of grief is all wrapped up in there. And especially when there's injustice, that the person didn't belong incarcerated in the first place, or it was for something really minor, but the effect on the family, all of the different institutional systems get involved and cause even more losses.
Absolutely.
And Halfway Home it's about well, it's all of it. What led up to incarceration, during incarceration, and the fact that there are people who are never free.
Right.
With probation, parole, having to register for life, job applications.
Can't get benefits, can't vote without a lot of activity to try and get back your voting rights. Yeah.
So that's another one of those kind of ambiguous losses, in a way, an example of an ambiguous loss.
It is a great example, and I'm an abolitionist, and so in part because the impact on the person, we don't do any rehabilitation here in this country, but the impact on the family, there is such a loss when somebody is taken out, and then such a cost to the family just to talk to them, to visit them, to whatever it might be. And then I mean, you essentially have a person who's there, but they're not there. You can't maybe touch them. You can't celebrate with them. You can't. And if somebody who I had a cousin who's incarcerated when one of my aunts died, and it was her son, and the amount of money it would have cost us as a family to allow him to be transported, have a moment where he could be alone because he couldn't attend the service with other people. It was so, we just didn't have it. And it felt so inhumane that one, he could not come and say a final farewell to his mother. And also we couldn't grieve with him. And it was because of this exorbitant cost. So yeah, I think there is a lot that happens there with the grief. And because somebody's incarcerated, we don't always get you don't get the sympathy necessarily of like, oh, your loved one is not accessible, right? Because people maybe have some moral judgments or whatever that might be. So thank you, Hanifa, for sharing that. We are at 1:28, and if there are no other questions or comments or suggestions, I just want to thank you all again on behalf of Division 49 for attending. What will happen is I'll send a follow-up email with the resources and the post-webinar evaluation and assessment. So thank you all so very much. I appreciate it. I hope you all have a really good end to the year and great start to the new year. And I know that this has been an exhausting year in many ways, and there are lots of things that we're grieving as a society and a collective. And so I hope that you can rest so that we can be rejuvenated and fueled up for the work we have to do in the coming years. You all have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
And thank you.